All right. So our Constitution doesn't forbid liberties. Our Constitution articulates liberties. People put hindrances and limits on people. So we have history. We have a dark history as a nation of forbidding and keeping people from their liberties. And in the state of Idaho, we'll be one of the front leading states. Of course, we're late in the forming of the states coming together, but Idaho has acknowledged women's rights before most other states did. Wyoming being the first state to allow women, I would argue women had the right to vote before then, but men forbid them from voting. And I don't think the Constitution actually forbid it. It was just a practice. And so when Wyoming puts it into law that women can vote, and then Idaho's not far behind that. Of course, we're kind of developing in the same era as Wyoming is. That Idaho recognizes the rights of women and the benefit that women are to society as well. Idaho, even the only state in all 50 states of the United States that has a woman artist that designed our state flag, our state symbol. And so the state of Idaho has, from our early days, acknowledged the benefit of women. Women business women engaged in all forms and all ways throughout society. I mean, you're a successful businesswoman that's really built upon the framework of previous generations that said women can start businesses and run businesses as well. And so women's rights in that respect, politically, inside of our communities. Twin Falls has a woman mayor. Other cities have women mayors as well, but I think women in the state of Idaho can live inside of that freedom better than most states historically. And so I think that that's a blessed kindness from God. The second part of that question was equal pay. Now that's a complicated one, only in the sense that does the government have a role in forcing companies to pay women the same as men? And so that kind of a discussion, Leah, I think is helpful, but as a constitutionalist, uh, less regulation gives all of society more ability to live free. So when does the government come in and force a company to pay women the same amount that they pay men? I say the capitalistic market takes better care of that than the government can take care of that. So full disclosure from companies of what they're paying their executives will impact the commercial, the local economy, that if they know that this company is mistreating or not paying a woman the same amount they would pay a man, the community ought to know that, and the community then ought to have the complete liberty to not purchase from that company, to not trade with that company until they bring that pay up into an equal place. I'm of the opinion that equality in the commerce is better fit for the commerce, for a free commerce. When the state or when the federal government begins to regulate, it always takes things and ratchets them even tighter. They have a tendency to overcorrect and go a limiting position rather than a free commerce where a businesswoman loves to take care of her employers, her employees, takes care of her customers. The community will naturally respond to that by bringing their business there, and she will increase in those respects. So, I think there is a true inequity in certain executive levels, more in the executive level of offices than in the common hourly wage earners of a society. But there's no reason a woman can't make as much as a man. It's just absurd to think that a woman can't because she's a woman in that arena of life. Reproductive rights. So I will assume here that you're meaning abortion.
The question was submitted, so I can't really assume too much about it. I
Sure.
think like family planning,
Okay.
access to birth control, I would also probably include, the right to terminate pregnancy.
Right.
But it's just as good a gift as
Sure.
the reproduction right.
Sure. So, I mean, I would, for best way to articulate how I would think through that, certainly I want women to have health care. I want women to have access to health care. I want them to have great conversations and private conversations with their doctors. There's no reason that they shouldn't. Reproductive rights. If we then move that into conversations about birth control, again, historically, you would find that's a discussion that some inside of churches would hold different than those outside of churches. But we're probably in a day where that's probably a little more mixed and not as well articulated. But that's a better discussion, a spiritual question, a religious question. If a particular religion believes that all children are a blessing from God, then that church ought to have the liberty to encourage their people to not participate in birth control, but not a government. A government doesn't have a place at this table to mandate or require that a woman that a woman has to have birth control. So we move it into the education field. When the question will come, when should the government begin to teach and educate about reproductive, both male and female? Well, my position that even that it's not a place for the government. It's a place for the home. It's a place for the church. It's a place for the community. Now, I know the pushback that comes into this, well, what about someone who doesn't have a dad who's going to sit down and talk about reproductive rights or reproductive biology, or a mother? Or goes to church, and what if their church doesn't ever even talk about it? Because that's the case in a sad case in many places. So then where does someone get access to or have a discussion about reproductive biology? Well, again, it's like other things with our government. The government's not fit to do this. The government's not designed for this. A constitutional republic has limited powers. Doesn't have broad entangling powers. It has limited, restricted powers. So I don't think that the government has a place at the table of the discussion. We have a concern for our community. We have, again, back to even some of the previous discussions, even private organizations that are not religious based have a vested interest in reproductive rights. The teaching, the education, all those things, I think is a free market, a free society, has room for both religious teachings and non-religious teachings on the matter. Now, when we move into the discussion of abortion or a woman's right to terminate the life in the womb, I do think the government has a discussion here, because the government's vested interest is life. The preservation, the protection of life. So I know that society has a big debate about this, and we've been debating this even before the Roe v. Wade opinion of the Supreme Court. States were aborting babies legally before Roe v. Wade happened. Roe v. Wade just then told states, you need to begin regulating this. So states have been regulating abortion since 1973. So consequently, the United States has murdered over 61 million babies in the wombs of women in this nation. That's more than Stalin murdered. That's more than Hitler murdered. It's more than both of them together. Those genocides and those horrific days of other nations, the United States has been murdering our own children in the womb, and I think the state and the nation has a vested interest in the preservation of all life. Biologically, it's clear. A miraculous thing happens at fertilization and conception. And there is something that majestically is happening inside of the womb of that woman that is developing a human child. From conception to natural death is really the place where I land on that. I think the state has a vested interest in all life. And so I certainly understand we're in a city that allows abortion. I'm one who argues we don't need for Roe v. Wade to be overturned because Roe v. Wade gave states the authority to regulate it. I'm saying it's foolish of us to regulate the murder of children, the murder of humans. We need to do all we. There's a lot in this discussion. Again, I'll come back to the community. A woman finds herself in a hard situation, a pregnancy she wasn't expecting. How does the state compassionately care for her? This is how currently the state compassionately cares for her. We can remove that child and you can go back to living life how you want to live. I say, is that compassionate? Is that compassionate to the woman? It's certainly not compassionate to the child in the womb. So that discussion, I'm not afraid to have in a public arena. And I have the public discussion in my own city, and I want to have it at the State House as well, because I think life is that sacred. The issues of because the state does regulate medications and does have a say in birth control, and so yes, it is engaged and it does have the discussion. I still argue the state doesn't have the capacity to express compassion for the unexpected, for the unplanned, rape, and incest, and unknown pregnancies or unexpected pregnancies. The state is not equipped to handle that level of the compassionate side of it. Where the state has a say in the healthcare side of it concerning birth control, one has to ask, well, what kind of birth control? Because again, if life begins at conception, and obviously I'm expressing that's where I believe that it happens. I think we can see that biologically, that something, again, miraculously happens at that moment when the egg is fertilized. And so what's happening at this moment with a medication or a birth control that impacts the fertilized egg. So an abortifacient, a birth control that aborts the pregnancy. I would say the state has a vested discussion at this table because, again, we're dealing with life. I'm not like most pro-lifers. Most pro-lifers want to say that life, they'll agree with me that life begins at conception, but they want to say we'll give a couple of exceptions. So they're inconsistent in their pro-life. I'm an abortion abolitionist, meaning because I do believe life begins at conception, people will know from my vantage point that I would be consistent, that life begins at conception, and that the state has a vested interest to preserve that life. And then the state needs the compassionate care of the local community to help that woman walk through the unexpected day. And families are better equipped to do that. Communities are better equipped to do that. And again, whether it's religious-based or not, private organizations know how to better compassionately care than the state. The state is not designed to be compassionate.
And I think what you touch on is very important because a lot of times with the pro-life spectrum or conversation, you don't always pinpoint that there's pro-life. There's a big difference between being pro-life or pro-birth.
Right.
Because life, quality of life,
right,
of the mother, or just the child even,
right.
and if the mother isn't part of the picture, continues past the birth,
Sure.
with education, with health care, with
Right.
just making sure that there's support networks are in place.
Right.
So a lot of times pro-life birth traditionally end the conversation is at birth.
Right.
Like it's championing for the birth. But what about the conversation? The more important conversation is how do we raise this child to be a productive society,
Right.
a member of society, or
Sure.
wholesome
And
upbringing?
would you rather your child be raised by the state or by your parents or by a family or by a community? Yeah, it will always go bad when children are raised by the state, by the federal government. God designed us to be raised in family units. Now, those family units may look quite different and diverse, but there's no doubt that the state is just not equipped and fit to do that.
Thank you for answering that question. Okay. What are some of the issues you identify affecting Idahoans currently and in the near future?
Yeah, and I think we've been touching on some of them. Education. We've got to unroll the big discussion about education. and the pay of our teachers, what's going on. The state of Idaho, I can appreciate this. The state of Idaho is one of the freest states concerning how local communities educate their children. They give parents the first set at the table. Homeschooling in Idaho is one of the freest places that you can homeschool your children in. We can appreciate the private school industry. We can appreciate the charter school, the benefit that it is, as well as the constitutionally mandated role of the public education in the state of Idaho. All of those together, the state of Idaho recognizes that education is really diverse, and it appreciates families that educate their children. It appreciates communities that educate their children. And then when it's not successfully being accomplished, the state does have a vested interest, because a literate community, a well-taught community, is a prosperous community. So education will always be a pretty important question at the state level. And that's definitely one of those places where I want to keep the liberty inside of the homeschooling, the private, and the charter, and the partnership that they all have with the public school. So I think the agricultural component of our state will always be a top priority. We from the north part of the state to the desert regions down here in the south central part of the state, agriculture is our bedrock. Technology will continue to advance, and we can hope that our state will stay on top of technologies. But the moment we abandon the agricultural discussion, the state has a vested interest in that discussion. Water rights, cattle grazing, those are some of that preserving of the environment as well as the economy. Again, they're all necessary with each other. So those are some of the top things that I see that will continue to be. Really, they're not any different. They're not new priorities that I see. I think they're ongoing.
And then in the near or currently, I think that we haven't really talked about like the pandemic, but currently Idaho is maneuvering through that. If you care to talk about that or just on that, how it's been handled or what we kind of.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to be able to better articulate how to navigate through a pandemic like this in the coming months. I don't think we're long away from being able to really assess and evaluate how we did. I think the state has done fairly well. I'm a member of the Constitution Party, so I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Democrat. I'm a part of the Constitution Party of Idaho. So I believe in less regulation again of the state. We're familiar with the Bill of Rights, which are laid out, those first 10 amendments to our Constitution of the nation. The state of Idaho has a similar description inside of our state constitution that lays out the rights, and then it begins to unfold what people don't really articulate. They just use buzzwords like Idaho common sense, like it's common sense to not touch a hot burner, but it's a learned and an observed position. I'm going to stop for a minute because I heard a beep, but it was outside. Okay, sorry to interrupt. I even interrupted my own thought.
Common sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So common sense is vague language. There's actually it's not a formal document of the nation, but there's a helpful guide to the Bill of Rights, and it's called the Bill of Responsibilities. The personal responsibility is the only way we can live in a great free society, that individuals take responsibility for themselves. So a pandemic, so first of all, we all know it's not the first pandemic that's ever come across the landscape of the nation or the state. But there certainly has to be some observations from this compared to how other pandemics have occurred and what came of them. So, I would rather have seen our governor not restrict the state, and then I would have rather our governor not abandon the responsibility to bureaucracies such as health districts. Health districts are bureaucratically driven. They're not driven by the people. They're driven by agencies that work for the government. And so I'm a big adherent to personal responsibility. So we live in Idaho. Our winters are all over the place. They can be really bad or they can be pretty mild and pretty simple. If a blizzard breaks out, I take personal responsibility. I have to assess, is it a risk for me to get out and go to the grocery store during the blizzard? My personal responsibility has to assess that. If I do get out, drive to the grocery store, I can't blame the government for telling me I shouldn't have gone to the grocery store. When we remove personal responsibility from the equation, we actually limit liberty. Common sense, articulated by a Bill of Responsibilities, says, I realize if I get out during this blizzard that I may put other people at risk. I might run into somebody. I might end up in a bank on the side of the road. Now I've got to require the medics to come help me get out. I get a tow truck. So I'm putting other people inside of the consequences of my responsibilities. I have to own them. I have to pay for them. I cannot expect or demand my government to do for me what I can do for myself. So whenever I look at what's happened inside of this pandemic, my personal preference would have been that the governor would have not restricted us. We needed to know what's going on. It's a real. I've sat down with people that have COVID-19. I've experienced their suffering and their hardship. So I don't deny that it's not a real virus. I just don't want my government restricting liberty. And that's what a government does whenever it takes on the position of a parent for the people. It really appears the great emergency that was declared was not as a result of the pandemic. The emergency that we've experienced is because a state of emergency was declared. And so it's affected the economy. And I say, bless the Lord, our economy is recovering. And the state of Idaho is experiencing quite a bit more liberty than most other states. But Leah, I just read last night a church in Moscow, Idaho, one of their deacons and two other people in their church were arrested for standing outside singing, and they were arrested for not having masks on or practicing social distancing. Well, that's a direct violation of the Constitution that gives churches, people, individuals, the right to worship God. And the government, that local government, came in because the governor gave a local health district and that local community, you do what you want to do there rather than on the state side, which I would have rather have not said anything. Let us know there's a danger. And then
we're in a pocket of space and time, locally, nationally, individually, where we have to look at these fine lines.
Right.
Because all violation of human rights, all violation of liberty is a game of fine lines.
Right.
My background living in the Soviet Union,
it's
always that frog in a room temperature water being boiled and not being thrown into boiling water.
Right.
To have a reflex. It's a slow grooming and a tolerance for self-surrender of liberty. And it's very, very dangerous to see that flirting happening with liberty.
Right.
I would say even fascism, or I would even say any kind of authoritarian sentiment in relation to us as government.
Right. Right.
And forgetting who works for who.
Yeah, exactly, Leah.
Who's in servitude.
Right. I appreciate that you've brought up your past, because you know what it's like to be in a place where you can't live out in personal liberty, and then by the kindness of God that your family was able to come, and you've experienced and tasted that differences more than most have, and it's a real part of your experience in life, and I even just recently during the special session of the legislature that I went up one of the days to listen in, and I listened to an individual that had moved here from a communist-ruled country, and she pleaded with the legislators, if this continues in the projection that it currently is, that we're in still a state of emergency, that's really my opinions inside of this. It appears the state of emergency was called for so that it could liberate some federal money to come in and help the economy that the state of emergency caused. So that's personal opinion and observation of it. But I heard this woman say that if we don't keep our freedoms here, where else do I go? Where else do I live? Where else do I flee to? I've already fled from places that are restricting my liberties. Where do I go now?
It's always a time to pay attention, but it's definitely right now a time to pay attention and not be apathetic.
Right.
And assume that liberty's out there like air.
Yeah.
It's not out there like air.
No.
It's not an element.
Yeah.
It's definitely something that is either exercised or it vanishes.
Right.
And to the point where, you could talk about defending liberty, but there's almost no liberty to defend.
Yeah.
It becomes a myth.
Right.
So thank you. I appreciate you touching on that. So let's find a spot here. Okay. Do you recognize that there are historically marginalized communities? How will you work to include unrepresented voices at the decision-making table?
Yeah. So words obviously have to have meaning to them, and just as to get whoever submitted this question would be helpful for me to ask back, what do you mean by marginalized communities? Just as I want to ask, what do you mean by reproductive rights? There's probably a lot inside of that question of marginalized communities. And so to the issue, I have to make some assumptions as to what the person who submitted the question means. It could mean women. It could mean people of certain ethnic backgrounds. It could mean people of an LGBTQ community. It could mean a lot of things. It could mean Christians. It marginalized in the sense of how they're being treated inside of culture. So a constitutional republic is the best fit government to take away the marginalization, to remove the diminishing of the human that we're dealing with. Now, if inside of the question of marginalized communities we're dealing with ethical or moral or biblical activities or lifestyles, I certainly have an opinion inside of that, but I don't think that puts me in a place where I can't treat someone as a human, that I couldn't recognize that someone who doesn't look like me or think like me or live like me doesn't have value as a image bearer of the Almighty God, and doesn't have intelligence or doesn't have skill. No society should unfairly treat anybody in its community. Now, I want to walk carefully here as a pastor, as one who lives his life off of the principles and the precepts that the Scriptures teach, that there are dangerous lifestyles that individuals can engage in that do not display the glory of God. It doesn't mean that they're not a human. It doesn't mean that they don't have value as a person, but they're engaged in a lifestyle that is not declared by, as God would describe as, a relationship between a male and a female, or that a boy would think that he could become a girl, or vice versa, inside of the transgender discussion inside of that. I'm not afraid of the discussion. I want to talk compassionately in it, while at the same time acknowledging that God, and by the way, I'm not afraid to leave God out of or remove God from the conversation. Our Idaho Constitution very distinctly says this: we, the people of the state of Idaho, grateful to Almighty God. So our Constitution, our preamble to the Idaho Constitution, actually puts God, the discussion of God, at the very first of everything else that flows from it. So I'm not afraid to have a spiritual discussion, because our state Constitution gave gratitude to God for our liberties, our freedoms that we have in the state of Idaho. So when I come to the discussion table and talk about, does that include, what do we do with marriage? Well, I'm a constitutionalist. I don't think the state has a voice or a say in who can and who can't get married. So this may shock some people that I don't appreciate that the state mandates that I have to go to the state to get a license to marry a couple in my church. The state is infringing on my religious freedom. Marriage is a sacred, holy harmony that God puts together of man and woman. As a pastor in this community, I don't need the state's permission to marry men and women. So, unfortunately, the state's been doing this for so long that we think that's the state's always been doing it. We forget it's really just as early as the late 1990s that the state of Idaho removed what's called common law marriage. I would say, well, why did you do that? The state, there was nothing really, there's probably lots of rationale that people can give to it. But whenever the LGBTQ community wants to have a tax benefit that the state gives to heterosexual couples, then it's clear the state's treating the people unfairly. And so I want to have that discussion. I say to the state of Idaho, get out of our marriages. And then I would say to the LGBTQ community, why do you want a document that the state has no authority to be giving in the first place? Now, someone in that community comes to me and asks, will I do their weddings? I'll tell them no. But it's not because I don't value them as a person. It's because I'm conducting my religion under the precepts that God's given me and directed me to do. And so I'm not hindering anyone from doing what they want to do. I'm saying I will only marry a man and a woman. Now, that's what I do as a pastor. The state, I say to the state, let's get out of the marriage license business. It's none of our business. Quit regulating things you don't need to regulate. That's what I want to have that discussion.
Fair enough. Okay, our last question is, what sets you apart from your opposition, and why should we vote for Mr. Thompson?
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I want to speak kindly of my opponent as well. We both live in the same city, so I would consider ourselves neighbors, even though we don't live next door to each other. So I can appreciate what Mr. Clow has been engaged in. You know, he's been on our city council for a long time. He's been our mayor. He's now been representing us at the State House now for about 8 years. And so I don't want to disparage the man as a person. I appreciate him as a fellow citizen of Twin Falls. But there are some things that separate the two of us. The first being, I believe that our education ought to be local. And I'm not suggesting that Representative Clow doesn't think that, because I believe that he would, because he's a Republican, the Republican platform would argue that education ought to be local. But the practice of Republicans right now is that we have a federal Department of Education that really mandates what the local has to do. And so I would say this is one of the things that would likely separate the two of us, maybe thinly here, but I want to completely sever the relationship that the state of Idaho has with the federal Department of Education. And that's on the premise here, because I'm a constitutionalist. The federal Department, the federal Constitution has no such thing as a federal Department of Education. So by necessity, out of the federal Constitution, education is a local, it's a state issue. Our state Constitution does address education. So let's treat the constitutions with respect. The federal Constitution doesn't need a federal Department of Education because it believes the local will educate their children. So that's one thing. My opponent sits as the chairman of the Education Committee of the state of Idaho. And so his voting record would show that he's not interested in severing the relationship with the federal Department of Education, and even so much so as giving a pathway for federal mandated education to fit upon the children of Idaho. That's one place that I think that we would see a difference. Another would be, it will appear to be a pretty thin position here, but this is going to be in a taxation position. Again, as a constitutionalist, we have to have taxes. But somewhere, someday, some state has got to stop taxing our income. Now, everyone loves to talk about that, but we can't even talk about that until we talk about the kind of money the state spends. Until we get our spending in control, we can't even talk about the illegal taxing of our income. Taxation needs to be more in the commerce, in the trade, in the purchasing, in the sales, in the paying fees for going to parks, or in various ways, paying for the services that you use. Taxing our license plates, or for transportation. But to tax our income is one of the most outrageous things, and it's been going on for decades. No one knows what it's like to not be taxed for their income, but it's an infringement upon the liberty of the people. The commerce will actually increase whenever we stop taxing the money a person makes. So that's probably, I've never had that personal of a conversation with my opponent here, but by, again, the fact of the way he votes at the State House, it appears that the end of taxation is nowhere. The reducing of tax will always have to be taxed to pay for services that a state provides. But the reducing of the spending, to talk about the reducing of income tax, and then the second one to that is our property taxes. Again, one of those places that's probably one of the most unfair taxing of people. Especially, I can see the rationale of taxing a property when it's purchased, because it's a sales transaction, it's a purchasing. But to continually, perpetually, forever tax a property owner is an infringement upon his property. He's actually in an agreement with the government that he's paying rent for his own property. So that's, again, I've not had that personal of a conversation with Representative Clout about taxation, but those, by the voting that he does, were one of those things that would separate the two of us. I would assume. I'd love to have that conversation with him. And then a third place that separates us is the issue of abortion. All Republicans love to proclaim that they're pro-life individuals. That's how a lot of times that's how they get elected, is they tell a conservative-minded community they're pro-life. And Representative Clout is a classical pro-life candidate. Pro-life except for in cases of rape and incest. And because my conversation about this is about, where does life begin? And so, not to rehash the previous conversation, but as an abortion abolitionist, I'm saying to the voters of the city of Twin Falls that over 200 babies are murdered in our city alone. Not to mention the other 3 locations in the Treasure Valley where a woman can get an abortion. But in this city alone, 200 babies are aborted on an annual basis. I cannot find that that's a pro-life position. And it's happening on the watch of a supermajority Republican legislature, where all they do is regulate. Now, I
know someone will ask you,
sure,
where's that information?
Yeah.
Where is it sourced? So could you just...
Yeah, all that information about the statistics of abortions, the Idaho Health and Welfare, the Central Health District here, they'll send you the whole report on about abortions. It's a pretty surprising document that they actually track the kinds of abortions. So not to be too much on the topic here, Leah, but many people will say that when they hear that abortions happen in Twin Falls, their assumption is, because their representatives that they continue to elect continue to promote, that only abortions of rape and incest happen. So that's the mindset. It's been the people of the city of Twin Falls have been educated to think that the only abortions that happen here are rape and incest abortions. So I stop and I say, okay, wait a minute. We have another problem then. If 200 abortions are happening in this city, and they're all only because of rape and incest, we have a bigger problem than anyone knows. These abortions that are happening here are selective, and the health district reports them. And so just a simple search on Idaho Health and Welfare, and you'll find the documents there. It'll state exactly how many happen in Twin Falls, the kind of abortions that happen here. All of that's listed. We're a government that records the murder of our children.
Thank you for going through all the questions with me and agreeing to have an interview and talk on these issues. They're not all very comfortable and easy topics, and I really admire and respect the fact that you sat down with me to talk about them. And as a community, we have to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Not in the reactive way, but in a responsive way. So in cooperation for the solution instead of rejecting the conversation, the reaction, shutting it down.
Right.
That's easy to do.
Yeah, it is. And I appreciate the opportunity as well. Thank you.
Before we end, I want to make sure that voters can get more access to you and information. Where can they get some more information about you, and anything else you'd like to say before we close the interview?
Thank you, Leah. But they can visit my website, votepaulthompson.com, and have a lot of these issues that we've talked about here. I've articulated them perhaps in a more concise manner. I'm a preacher, so sometimes I can get a little long-winded, but they're laid out there, and we're adding additional things to that on a regular basis when questions come up. Frequently, we have a list asked, and they can read them. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram as well. But thank you. What's that?
Watch you garden and we garden.
Yeah, if you get over to my personal Facebook pages, you'll see the weeds that grow in my garden.
Sure. I think a lot of people can relate.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.